Well, Representative Earl Blumenauer, welcome to the Climate Pod.
My pleasure, Ty.
Well, you've been such a champion for the environment and for climate issues, really your entire career. Why has this been such a big part of your political agenda?
Well, in large measure, because that's the world in which we live, and being able to manage the climate challenge has been an important part. Oregon has been in the forefront. I was on the Portland City Council when we were the first city in America to sign on to a low carbon future, being involved on the energy conservation, alternative energy, and carbon pollution. The evidence is compelling that this is our future. We have a limited period of time, and the evidence is stronger that limited period of time is getting shorter, and the dynamic is more critical than we thought. So to me, it's the only way I can represent this community as well as the future of my grandchildren.
Well, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the 2020 election was one of the most important elections, maybe of our lifetimes. Not only did President Biden win the White House, but Democrats took a slim majority in the Senate and kept the majority in the House. How important do you think it was how important was the Democrats' commitment to combating the climate crisis to the 2020 election results?
Well, in an election that was as close as it was, I think all of these items assume a critical nature. Now, notwithstanding the fact that President Biden got far more votes than Donald Trump, there were narrow victories in states like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And we know that people who cared deeply about a low carbon future, energy conservation, our children's future, they were activated. And in fact, this was, I think, without question, the most important election in American history. Winning those 2 seats in Georgia completely changed the dynamic of this Congress. It meant that instead of the work that we did in the House, sending over solid environmental and infrastructure and equity proposals to die in Mitch McConnell's legislative hospice, all of these proposals will now have their day in court. They're not all going to pass necessarily, but it means that the Democratic committee chairs and the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, are going to allow them to be heard. And there is an overwhelming commitment from the Democrats in the Senate, along with what we've done in the House, to a low carbon future. We'll have a chance to make our case to the American public. The work that we're doing now on infrastructure is built around reducing carbon emissions. We've got so many elements here that I've got climate emergency legislation, polluter pay, reinstating the superfund. I mean, what we're going to do with wind energy. The list is extensive, and we've got a great opportunity for them to be enacted by this Congress. And unlike what we faced in the prior administration, we have a president who will sign them into law and in fact will be urging us to do more.
Well, you were one of the earliest supporters of the Green New Deal, but it didn't have, at the time anyways, widespread support among Democrats in Congress. Do you think that's changed as a result of the 2020 election?
Well, I think people are appreciating what was meant by the Green New Deal. It was an aspiration that was important for Democrats and frankly for the American public. And as people learned more about what we're trying to do, there is more public support for it. It is opportunities dealing with clean energy, energy conservation, electrification of our transportation system and strengthening the grid. What we are finding is that day by day, week by week, people understand what these stakes are. Looking at the disaster that was Texas during the unseasonably cold weather, but the vulnerability of the grid in Texas put lives at risk. What we've seen in terms of people in just the last 2 years with the horrific wildfires, that's kind of a preview of coming attractions. It's not just the West Coast, and it's not just what's happened in Australia. This is a global threat. And I think it's interesting that people are starting to understand and appreciate. There's always been climate activists and people who have been involved, but I think the awareness is growing as the peril becomes more pronounced, and we see more and more people who literally the lives are at risk, who are willing to accept a low carbon future and reform.
Well, you touched on this earlier, but in February, you, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Senator Bernie Sanders introduced the Climate Emergency Act. Why did you put forth that legislation?
Well, as you know, in the last Congress, we introduced a resolution calling for climate emergency with AOC and Bernie. And it was actually great fun to work crafting that legislation with members of the environmental community here in Portland, Oregon. Taking the next step to actually urge the president to declare a climate emergency enhances the powers available to him. We saw emergency provisions in the last administration being perverted by Trump to steal money from projects like housing of our veterans and members of the armed forces, to divert it for his border wall, which wasn't a national emergency. But this would enable more tools to be mobilized and more resources to be deployed, because we are in fact in a climate emergency, and the evidence grows by the day.
Well, President Biden hasn't yet declared a climate emergency, but he did introduce the American Jobs Plan, which will invest $2 trillion in building a more sustainable and hopefully a more just infrastructure. So what are your thoughts on the American Jobs Plan?
Well, I am very pleased with the administration from the first hours they were in office. For instance, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, reversing some of the destruction of the prior administration, being able to strengthen protections, things that he could do administratively. We've gone ahead in terms of enacting other legislation, as you know, that deals with the COVID crisis, health issues, and moving ahead on infrastructure. The vision of the Biden administration with this comprehensive American Jobs Act is really exciting. It covers from literally A to Z in terms of infrastructure, opportunities, putting more money behind it, being able to deal with surface transportation, with water. I like the fact that they're not nibbling around the edges, proposing to replace all these lead pipes that are literally poisoning our children and hurting their ability to succeed in school. The investment in broadband. We're finding out as we live on Zoom calls these days, and we are dealing with telemedicine in the pandemic, that people don't have access to clinics safely, that children are learning remotely. Such an investment in the broadband infrastructure is a huge opportunity to be able to strengthen these connections and whether it's the broadband or it's the electrical grid, all of these are providing more efficiency to be able to take advantage of the technologies. I just couldn't be more pleased with how the table has been set. And now it's up to all of us to be able to make the case and get it across the finish line.
Well, there are aspects of President Biden's American Jobs Plan that include making polluters pay for the damage that they've done to the environment and to our climate. And this has really been an important issue to you in the legislation that you've proposed. So, why do you think it's so important to make polluters pay?
Well, we have serious resource questions. There's never really enough money to do all the good things that we want to do. But it seems to me that at a minimum, we ought to make sure that the corporate interests that create problems ought to clean up after themselves. That's kind of what kids are taught in kindergarten. It's a good motto for life. We did this with the Superfund Act, as you know, that enacted a small fee on these petrochemical industries that created these toxic messes in exchange for some relief legally. They committed to the tax that provided the fund to clean it up. But that tax expired in 1995. So the Superfund didn't have the money to be able to do the fund cleanup, which meant that it dramatically reduced the amount of cleanup operations, and it shifted the cost to people who had been left behind. It is in many communities where there are Superfund cleanup activities, including in my community in Portland, Oregon, the burden has been shifted to some of the people who are just left standing. The Superfund enabled us to have resources to pay for problems that were created by people who die or go bankrupt or who move on. And if we don't have that fund paid for by the industry, it shifts the cost to everybody else. And that just decidedly is not fair. It's not fair in terms of the resources, and it has dramatically slowed down cleanup of badly needed projects to restore the environment.
Well, you're going to be soon introducing new legislation to help pay for those Superfund sites. So, if passed, how will your legislation make those companies that are responsible for polluting those areas actually pay for the damage that they're causing?
What we will do is reinstate the tax on the petrochemical industry. And so all of them will pay a small amount into a fund that will help support cleanup operations. It takes some of the burden off people in some cases who had no connection to the actual pollution. They were just purchasers of property far removed in time from the actual source of the serious pollution. In some cases, there's nobody alive who was a part of that initial pollution, but the events linger. Having the Superfund pick up some of that tab is a more equitable approach. I will say, just elaborating a little further, one of the other things that needs to happen with polluter pay is to make sure that the federal government meets its obligation. For instance, a Superfund site we have here in Portland, Oregon, in the Willamette River, is a site of where the United States government built and decommissioned battleships in 3 wars: World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. There's a lot of pollution there that the Department of Defense should help clean up. The polluter should pay. But so far, we've had real trouble getting the Pentagon to acknowledge their responsibility and to participate with the rest of us.
Well, it also seems like, America's had a problem getting corporate polluters to pay even their fair share in taxes. And I know that you, Representative Katie Porter, Representative Donald McEachin, and previous guest of the Climate Pod, Representative Sean Casten, introduced legislation that would eliminate some of the most egregious tax breaks enjoyed by the oil and gas industry. Can you talk about some of those tax breaks and really help our audience understand just how much money these companies are avoiding in taxes?
Well, Congress has for years uh, provided extra tax benefits for the oil and gas industry under the notion that somehow that this would accelerate production of oil and gas, that it would just protect jobs, that it would lower prices for the consumer. No, that has not been the case. This is one of the most profitable industries in history that has been in the has been in the business here that it's estimated that all fossil fuels are indirectly benefiting or directly something like $650 billion per year. There are a number of these smaller items that we've targeted on the committee and that President Biden has included as part of the financing for the American Jobs Act. And there are tens of billions of dollars that are relatively simple fix to the tax code would result in increased revenues and having, again, polluters pay their fair share. But there's no end to the areas that we should actually be looking at. For example, why should oil and gas production on federal lands not pay global rates for their royalty rates? Why do we give them a break to the extent that the taxpayer is shortchanged? If it slows oil and gas production, so what? Keeping it in the ground a little longer is better for the climate, better for the planet, and it is entirely in keeping with having a level playing field to have people pay their fair share and not shortchange the taxpayer. These are areas that are long overdue for adjustment, for reform. It's an area that mystifies me that we have the difficulty getting people to step up to help the taxpayer and the environment. But I think with President Biden and some of the tax plans that they've advanced, I think we're going to have some success.
Well, it does seem obvious, honestly. Like, unless you're talking, about the people who are running these companies and who are, they're getting away with polluting the land and the water and the climate, and they're making huge profits off of it. It's hard to imagine anyone, Democrat or Republican, not wanting to hold these companies accountable for the damage that they're doing. But unfortunately, and my guess is that this, just like everything else, will become a partisan issue and likely a partisan vote. As a congressman, what do you think has led to such partisanship, even on some of the most obvious of issues?
Well, I mean, to be fair, we had Democrats from what we called the oil patch who didn't help us. I've introduced this legislation before, and there were former colleagues who from Texas who were very supportive of the industry and somehow correlated their constituents and the health of their state with being able to have more subsidies for oil and gas. I personally think that is a mistake. I think, for instance, the people who have been reluctant to hold industries accountable to clean up after themselves, like what we've got damage all over America from coal mining and old adequated oil wells that are still there and polluting, where the previous owner and developer of it moved on. They claimed bankruptcy. They have evaded their responsibility. We have on the books legislation that would require them to clean up after themselves, but there has been very lax enforcement to the extent that the American taxpayer suffers and the environment is damaged.
Well, do you think we'll get bipartisan support for combating the climate crisis, or do you think Democrats just need to push as much through as possible while they're in power, if anything is going to get done?
Well, there are two aspects to your question, because I know lots of people who are Republicans who support what we're doing. Lots of Republicans in my community who understand the nature of the climate crisis, for whom the proposals that I've made are reasonable and that they would be supportive. What we don't have is support in Congress from Republicans. They're reflexively opposed to the initiatives of Democrats. We saw it in the Obama administration, where there was just furious opposition as we tried to have a very modest proposal in terms of climate protection and very modest changes in terms of the revenue structure. And it's been developed into a high art. There is the deepest divisions in Congress that we've ever seen. The Recovery Act passed without a single Republican vote, even though the evidence is overwhelming that Americans supported the efforts in the Recovery Act for the health, for human infrastructure. Not a single vote. So it's going to require that Republicans around the country add their voices, that they evidence their support. We're seeing it in a number of areas with the business community. The business community is not monolithically opposed to the proposals that we're moving forward. There are business community interests that are recalibrating their approach to dealing with carbon pollution. I just got off an extensive Zoom call earlier in the day with people in electric utilities who are open to making some important changes here in the Pacific Northwest. This is the reality once you get off Capitol Hill. My hope is that we can have more people engage Republicans in business, in local government, Republican governors, mayors, to add their voices, to make it clear that this is not a stark partisan divide, except when you are on Capitol Hill.
Sure. And that, that division, that partisanship really has reached dangerous levels in this country, even leading up to those attacks on the Capitol in January. You were there that day. If you don't mind, just describe what that experience was like for you.
Well, Ty, it was deeply disturbing. I've been doing this all my career. I've been in Congress for 25 years. I've worked on issues from coast to coast and have sought to have bipartisan support on a number of these issues. But to watch 137 of my colleagues cheering on the rioters who were trying to, kill Speaker Pelosi, hang Mike Pence, and attack members of Congress and our staff and security, deeply disturbing. And it makes it hard to move forward when there are people who were urging on the rioters before the blood had dried, before the feces had been cleaned up, before the glass had been removed. That makes it's a very hard environment to work in. But as a practical matter, I think what we're doing is right. I think there is support by the American public for the Biden administration. And I think there will be proof of the wisdom of what we're trying to do. We have a chance of getting this enacted. This is going to be the most consequential session of Congress in American history. The most consequential. Stakes are high, but the problems demand action on this scale. So I appreciate the chance to talk with you about it, appreciate your work, and look forward to perhaps charting our progress and maybe talking in the future.
Well, the people of Portland are lucky to have you representing them in Washington, and people across the country that care about the climate and the health and well-being of everyone are really lucky to have such a climate champion in Congress as you. Representative Earl Blumenauer, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
My pleasure, Ty. Have a good day.